Tēnā tātou. Ka timata mehea me tētahi karakia mo te pōnei, mo tēnei o ngā huitopa e te pōnei. Tēnei te aro rangi nui e tsui honei, tēnei te aro papatua nuku e takoto nei. Tēnei te pō nau mai te ao, ka rangatia te ao ki aita, ka rangatia ko tānei i whakairi hia i āpiti ki runga i āpiti ki raro. Tāwhia mai, waho rawia mai i roto kia raraunga tapua e tāne whakapiripiri e tui honei. Hiki ki nuku hiki ki rangi wā te tū, ko te whai au, ko te ao mārama. Mārama hā roto ki tō pia ki tūri e turuku nei e rangi, turu o whiti whakamaua kia tīna, haumi e, hui e, tāi ki e, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko tai mai nei tēnei pō, i raro i ngā ahakoa ngā āhuatanga o te pō nei, o te wā nei, e kōrero hia nei i tēnei pō mo te tāmitanga o tātou whenua, o tātou kāinga, o tātou taonga, e tāmia nei e empire, e imperialism, e era momo mea, no reira, kia kaue tōro e nei kōrero, engari ka hoatu ki tō tātou kai whakawā, kai kōrero mo tēnei wā, e mihi nei kia koutou kua rumene mai, kua harabai ki te whakarongo nei, te pō nei, i te rānei. Nō reira, e mihi nei kia tātou katoa i raro i ēnei āhotanga. Ka huri atu kia koe, pass it over to you, Anjum, to welcome everyone and to introduce our amazing speakers for today's webinar. Tēnā tātou.
Kia ora. Thank you so much for opening us up with that beautiful opening. Yes, welcome again, everyone. My name is Anjum, ko Anjum Rahman, Tāwhana. I'm based in Kirikiriroa, Hamilton, and Aotearoa, New Zealand. And what I'm going to do is just introduce the topic and why we chose it, and introduce to you the format of the webinars and then the partners and the speakers. And I'll try to do that really succinctly and quickly because I know that you all want to hear from our amazing speakers. Why we decided to do this topic is because there were some concerns within the community that we're seeing people, and particularly some people on the left, turning towards China kind of in opposition to the hegemony of the United States, and especially with their change of government. And what this has meant is that what we're seeing sometimes is denial or underplaying some of the human rights abuses in China. And one of those issues that was a real concern is Uyghur genocide denialism, but there are a host of other things as well. Now, I did want to make clear here, particularly because we are situated in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and because we live in a society where there is racism, that our kōrero here is about the Chinese government. And the problem is when you are speaking into racism, then we don't want it to become a case that it is then acceptable to be racist towards any Chinese people here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And similarly, when we're talking about the United States of America, we are talking about their government. So that's, that needs to be really clear. And, individual people hold whatever views they hold, but we don't condone racism. We also want to be clear that we need to talk about these issues, and it's important to raise these issues. So the format of our webinar today is that we will have 3 speakers who will be speaking to you for around 10 minutes. And then we are going to then have some general questions that I'll be asking them to address. And then you will have the Q&A function should be there available to you. So just pop your questions in as they come up, and I'll be reviewing those questions. And once we get to the Q&A session, then I'll go through those and try and where there are like questions, make them into one question and address them to the panelists. So the partners in this project are quite a few, and I want to thank everyone who has supported the webinar today. So Asian Supporting Tino Rangatiratanga, Koekoeā, Indigenous Pacific Uprising, Uyghur Solidarity Aotearoa, People Against All Imperialism, Inclusive Aotearoa Collective Tāhono, and andIsland. Now, let me just quickly introduce our wonderful speakers. So speaking first will be Tina Ngata. Tina is a Ngāti Porou mother of two from the east coast of Te Ika a Maui, the North Island. Tina's work involves advocacy for environmental, Indigenous and human rights. This includes local, national and international initiatives that highlight the role of settler colonialism in issues such as climate change and waste pollution, and promote Indigenous conservation as best practice for a globally sustainable future. Thank you, Tina. Bali Nangavulan is a member of the Bunun people from Taiwan. He has long been engaged in Indigenous issues and is the host of the podcast Dear Han People. Throughout the show, they discuss various topics from their perspective, aiming to showcase the diverse realities of Indigenous peoples. His guiding principles come from the words of a late Bunun writer: "If your presence is to help me or to educate me, then please go back." Interesting. I hope you can explain that a bit more when you speak. Brian Hioe is one of the founding editors of New Bloom. He is a freelance journalist as well as a translator, a New York native and Taiwanese American. He has an MA in East Asian Languages and Cultures from Columbia University and graduated from New York University with majors in history, East Asian Studies, and English literature. He was a Democracy and Human Rights Service Fellow at the Taiwan Foundation for Democracy from 2017 to 2018 and is currently a non-resident fellow at the University of Nottingham's Taiwan Studies program. So thank you again, all three of you, for being here today to talk to us. I'm now going to hand over to Tina to start the kōrero.
Kia ora, tēnā koe, tēnā koutou me te mihi atu ki a koe tāwhana kua whakawātea te ara I raro I te marumaro o te kapua o te wāhi ngaro. Thank you, Tāwhana, for opening our evening tonight, and Anjum for welcoming us, and my respect and regards to you both, Bali and Brian. It's lovely to be able to be on this chat tonight with everybody. But one of the first kind of pātai that was, and a common pātai also that is posed is, to me of late, has been to talk about and understand the colonial context in Aotearoa Te Waipounamu, particularly in relation to the US and China. And I think one of the key things to understand about us is that there is, because of our geographical positioning, interfaced with our colonial positioning, there's a tension there. So we have been colonised by a Western Bloc state, that being Britain, and our geopolitical allies are largely Western Bloc states. So that's the UK, so-called USA, so-called Canada, Australia, and so we, within those alliances, we kind of are geopolitically positioned as a Western Bloc state. However, of course, we are geographically positioned very close to China, along with Australia. And so we have a number of particularly strong trade relationships and immigration relationships with China as well. And they're seen as a dominant economic force within the region that we are geographically located in. That important, like it's also important for us to recognize that there's our geographic positioning and then there's our geopolitical positioning. And so our geopolitical positioning, for instance, within transnational forums like the United Nations, we are geopolitically positioned as a Western European state, and our regional gatherings occur alongside Western European states. And it's so that I think that's a really strong indication of how much our colonial underpinnings influence how we perform on the world stage, is the fact that we're seen as a Western bloc state. So what does that mean today? One of the things that means is that as an Indigenous position, for us as Indigenous peoples living in a nation that has been colonized by a Western bloc state, our struggle has largely been with Western colonialism, a Western form of colonialism. And since post-World War II, we've seen the torch of the neo-imperial torch being passed across to the US, and the US has grown to be seen as one of the dominant neo-empires or neo-imperial forces since World War II. And so they've largely informed a lot of our resistance to colonialism, and it's so strongly recognized as the neo-imperial and neo-colonial force around the world that we equate the US state and US government with what colonialism looks like from an Indigenous perspective. So I think those are all really important things to consider, but also being a Pacific nation, being a nation located within the Pacific, even though in that international space we're seen as a Western bloc nation, we're also members of the Pacific, where there is a lot of neo-colonialism and imperialism between US and China playing out. So for instance, there's the economic imperialism of China within our Moana nations, where a raft of infrastructure has been underwritten by the Brick Road project through China. But also a number of NGO and a number of militarism kind of frameworks from the US also inform the lived experience of people across Te Moananui-a-Kiwa. And increasingly in Aotearoa, we've been getting drawn into military projects as well. And that's also a bit of a legacy of our colonial relationship to the US, which is largely informed through military, surveillance, border and immigration work streams. So we've seen, for instance, the Wellington Agreement, and I think that was 2010, where we started to agree to share training and military training between us and the US. We've seen the installation of, for instance, weapons launch sites and satellite launch sites, and increased shared military training between us and the US as well. So there's this real tension that is informed by our geographic positioning and our long-standing opposition as Indigenous peoples to militarism, to colonialism, and then our growing colonial ties with the US as well. And so all of those things create quite an interesting and difficult tension to be living in terms of the colonial ties for us here. Yeah. Did you have other questions, Anjum?
I think, what do you feel like are questions that you're grappling right now with that other the speakers might be interested in or might want to address?
So I think, there are a number of things that we've been seeing internationally that fall out of those tensions. And one of those tensions is, we've seen, as you pointed out when you introduced us all, we've seen that a number of our whānau, Indigenous whānau, this is not unique to Aotearoa, we see it in the global Indigenous village, are considering not just China, but BRICS nations in general as an alternative and an option to destabilize the Western bloc grip on the West. And so there is a level of concern about what that means. For a number of us who have spent many years in the global Indigenous movement, we've always seen it as a collective movement, and we don't leave anybody behind. We don't overlook the oppression. Nothing that we could possibly have to gain could be worth overlooking the oppression of our Indigenous brothers and sisters, particularly our tuakana, also from acknowledging that our whānau from Taiwan are our tuakana. We have relationships, historical relationships to our Indigenous brothers and sisters there. And another practice from that Indigenous space is that we don't talk over it. It's not natural for us to speak on their behalf, to speak on other people's behalf. At the same time, we come with privilege, a kind of and a form of privilege where we can actually use our voices and speak up a lot more than many of our brothers and sisters who are in spaces that are a lot more politically dangerous for them. There's a lot more immediate political danger. So I guess if I have a question, I'm aware of these tensions. I'm aware that some of this is strategic also. They're approaching the use of Indigenous peoples to destabilize the West is also a known strategy. I guess my question is, what's the best way for us to show up for you? One, we don't want to speak over our cousins and our brothers and sisters. But two, at the same time, we recognise that it's not always safe for them to speak for themselves either. So I'm here to also learn and know more about what is the best way for us to show up for our relations who are oppressed and struggle under the Chinese regime as well, recognising all of the the factors that I raised earlier. Those are some of the key things at the top of my mind.
Oh, thank you, Tina. Really appreciate that. So I might leave it there, and just reminding everyone, if you have questions, please do use the Q&A function. I'm definitely keeping an eye on it, so we'll try and make sure that your questions are addressed through that. I'm going to now hand over to Bali.
Hi.
Go ahead.
Okay. Mình cũng biết sao inang nang tu Bali Nangavulan taking han tu Taiwan nan tu Manaska tu Tubong tu Tashisham. Hello everyone. My name is Bali. I like to greet your first in my mother tongue, the Bunun language, and wish all of us a meaningful and beautiful exchange today. So I'm very happy I can in here to talk my opinion. And I'm Bali Nangavulan, a Bunun person living in Taiwan, and the host of the podcast Dear Han People. Our show is about speaking directly to the Han majority in Taiwan, sharing Indigenous experience and perspectives that are often overlooked in mainstream conversation. I'm not a scholar or researcher, so I can give an academic answer, but these topics are very personal to me. What I can offer is what I've observed and what we often discuss within our community. Because interesting in Taiwan, most Han people don't really use the term colonialism to describe their relationship with Indigenous peoples. It's usually Indigenous people who bring up at least perspective when talking about our history and position in a society. In my view, colonialism in Taiwan operated through education, the legal system and media and mainstream media, similar to many another country. But one thing that feel unique in Taiwan, I think, is that sometimes some people in trying to show support for indigenous people actually end up referring a Persian. This often happens during a moment when Taiwanese identity is being emphasized. For example, during the directly transitions or movement to separate from China. So during Chen Shui-bian during President Chen Shui-bian era, we saw the new partnership with indigenous peoples. President Tsai Ing-wen made a formal apology. There even happened when the Taiwanese government need to highlight this different from China. Indigenous people were treated for like the symbolic decorations, the actual partners. And when the government doesn't prioritize indigenous people issues, our right and voice are easily pushed aside. So this is one way settler colonialism continue to work in Taiwan. And for many indigenous people, the idea for US or China or of American is distant and uncleaner, because China feels more relief because of our long history living alongside Han people. So it's easier to imagine what a Han dominate country like China mean for us. But our understanding of both the US and China mostly comes from the Taiwan media. Unfortunately, many of the media channels that orders indigenous people watching learn pro-China. So many of our elders, just like the many Han people elders, believe the US is the one stirring up conflict between China and Taiwan. And our generation is different. We have access to more information and can make our own judgment. We know both countries have their problems, but from what we see now, China seems over nothing positive for indigenous people. It creates a lot of tensions within our community, especially between generations, because we can't agree on how to respond. And I don't have, because I get the question is how indigenous people negating these tensions. I don't have a cleaner answer yet, but we are trying to do this, be part of the Taiwanese public conversation. We organize community discussions, share our views on the social media, speak up about issues like the dysfunction in Taiwan's parliament, support a recall movement, and help fact-check misinformation online. Because we don't like the America and the Han people, because in my experience is not good. But we do all this because we living on this island too. When China applies pressures on Taiwan, no one, indigenous or Han people, will be safe. And our indigenous people, we know that is China ever take control here, the outcome for ours will like be tragic. So is my opinion. Thank you.
So can you, like, just picking up on that, can you tell us when you say your way of life would change, how do you think it would change? Like, what would be different? Just in your last comment, you said if China, you were saying if China takes over Taiwan, that your way of life will change. So what would that look like?
Because like in China now, they have like the indigenous people is the few people like the it's the Xizang people or the Uyghur to I don't know how to say the English. Because the China over control their language and culture, so they living very hard. I think the China's control of Taiwan is the same way to indigenous people, but it's very interesting because we audience always talk because have a joke like if the China Han people come to the Taiwan, we just say our mother tongue and go to the mountain. Is safe, but I think it's not too easy to save because we saw the Hong Kong issues and I say the Xizang wayward to the issues. I think the maybe copy on our community. I think it's very dangerous.
Great. All right. Thank you. Thank you very much. So I just want to make clear for our audience that Bali was talking there in that last comment about the Tibetan and Uyghur populations. So thank you. And I'm now going to pass the mic or the rako over to Brian.
Hi, everybody. So thank you for joining this webinar. I think my connection's a bit unstable, so just let me know if it breaks at any time. So yeah, I think particularly as we are in this period of US-China tensions, particularly from countries that think of themselves as Western countries, there's this strong tendency to fetishize and idealize China in juxtaposition to the West and the US. But this is deeply ironic because of the fact that China, in the course of its rise, is modeling itself after the US, attempting to build parallel institutions to those that allowed for US global hegemony after World War II. And then on the other hand, for example, China will occasionally use rhetoric as though it is a rising country that supports the third world and so forth. For example, pro-Palestine rhetoric. And yet then there are substantial ties between Israel and China in terms of technology. When you look at comments made by China's ambassador to Israel praising Israel, it's quite direct there. And what's interesting too is with regards to how China treats its so-called ethnic minorities, as it is framed in the official state discourse. Initially, when there were reports, for example, of the quote unquote re-education camps that Uyghurs are facing, many Western leftists denied this and said it's not true, it's not happening, this is Western propaganda. And then, on the other hand, China acknowledged this. It is happening. There are re-education camps. They are harmless. They're just for vocational training. That was the rhetoric. And so China is often actually, the government specifically, not the people, is not hiding what is occurring sometimes. And you can find about what is occurring through English language sources that are state-run media. And it's out there. And yet there's this kind of denial of that. And I think a lot of that really, again, goes back to this desire to see China as an alternative to the West and the US. It's projection. It's also a form of Orientalism, actually, in that sense. And so you have this kind of rhetoric, you have this treatment of indigenous people in China, and this has been ongoing for a while. And I think the lack of solidarity is, in fact, quite disappointing in that sense. There are movements in China. China recently saw the largest protests in decades, for example, when it formed the White Paper movement. And yet then there's not attention to that. I think that particularly the view is that the West is so bad and China is framing itself as an alternative. but is just another nation state. And you have, for example, claims brought out like, well, the US has 800 bases across the world, China only has one. Yes, that is true, but then it's very hard to have that set of historical circumstances that allowed the US to do that after World War II. I don't think the Chinese government is any different there. And I think then that there's this discounting of the movements that occur there, the resistance that occurs, because there is that is occurring. And many of the people, I think, because of the fact that much of the Western left has historically had this kind of idealization of China, that actually pushes a lot of the voices that are able to speak out into the political right. And so then they align themselves with conservative actors in Western countries, such as the US and beyond. And so there is that. And I think that because these are the voices that they seem to think are supportive. And so I think that is quite disappointing. And I think that particularly you have this kind of blindness. I mean, for example, there was one time I saw Mackenzie Wark post about China, and I remember her comments. I was like, well, if you just change every mention of China in this quote that talks about civilization to, let's say, a Western country like Germany, this is incredible ethno-nationalism. This would just be that. But then I think there is this kind of mystification of that. And I think a lot of the nationalist rhetoric that just comes directly out of China has then just been discounted. And I think that actually points to how there's this tremendous lack of attention to many parts of the world from the Western left, except in very narrow slices. I mean, for example, it's great that there are people paying attention to what's happening in Gaza, but then, for example, what about what is occurring in Southeast Asia? For literal decades, there's been a lot of fear about the PRC. I mean, for example, China frames itself as aligning with the Third World, but it fought wars in the modern history in Southeast Asia. It is often seen as backing the domestic authoritarian regimes that exist in, let's say, Myanmar or Cambodia and Laos. And these are very repressive of activists who then are facing great risks, actually. And I think that then particularly you have groupings like the Progressive International or people like Vijay Prashad, and there's this intellectual dishonesty in actually painting a picture of the world that is not the case. For example, India and China, of which are, the BRICS, are in fact have enormous tensions. They are not natural allies. And so I think there's a need to really look at things. And even groups that emerge, like, let's say, the Tāwhana Collective, interestingly enough, Tāwhana Collective is not, in fact, even reflective of for example, perspectives of Chinese left nationalists today that are apologists for the state. It's this kind of very diasporic take that is in fact very remote. And then this is taken and platformed as the view on China that is seen as accurate. I think that there's a need to actually do much more homework there. And so I think it's a challenge. And I think that as people engage with this, I think particularly as, for example, we see this rhetoric from Donald Trump against China, people will, again, just try to idealize China. And that actually really does a great disservice to what is occurring there, because it is in fact a place and there's resistance there. And like any other government, is a state. And so I think that there's this inability to distinguish the people in the state, which we see in the targeting, for example, of Asian groups in the West, oftentimes. But then we have to do better than that. We have to do better than this kind of fear-mongering or just seeing things in terms of states rather than peoples. And I think that is a challenge. Yeah, I mean, I can leave it there, I guess, for a bit.
I did want to pick up, because it's really interesting when you talk about that Indian context. And of course, in India, we have the rise of Hindutva extremism. We have a pretty authoritarian government there. And so often you find, or it can be the case, that some of the resistance in India then sees China, as an answer. And I guess the other part is that in a world where you have all these powers, there's Russia in there's Europe does its thing as it usually does, that people are looking for where is the end of this coming from? Where is the balance to the US, for example, coming from? So what do you think about that in terms of, China seeming to be taking that space, almost of the savior of us all?
Yeah, I think it's actually very interesting because this is honestly also how US imperialism has often framed itself as, again, like, oh, we are the free world, we come in and democratize. And then I think that there's often this tendency when you're in your own context and facing a authoritarian or oppressive government, then you idealize what is out there. And then that is China in this case. And yet that, in fact, is a form of projection. I think it just doesn't really get to the realities of that. I think we really need to think beyond just going for the support of other nation states and saying that they're completely different than what the threat we're facing close to home is. And in fact, they're actually quite similar. And I think that honestly, I think a lot of the rhetoric coming out of China about how it is, again, helping rising countries resist Western hegemony, you could just trade out the words and put in the US and democracy is the other term. And it sounds actually very similar. And I think that there's just this need to think beyond projection. That's I think very challenging, unfortunately, in these times.
Yeah, it's kind of like what you're saying is that, it's the people, not the governments, that are going to solve this. Am I putting words in your mouth? Is that kind of what you're saying?
But I think that it is challenging because I think people should always go look at the people and talk to the people rather than look at things in terms of states. I think that people who are very critical of states in their domestic context, the state that they're up against, then have this blindness where they actually will criticize, for example, the racism against, let's say, Chinese migrants because of the fact they're conflated with their state. But then they will also do that kind of conflation themselves in seeing the state as reflective of the view of the people when it is not. For example, China is one of the world's most unequal societies, and yet the government talks about, oh, we are socialist. And then people will just believe it at face value, and I find it remarkable. And then when they talk about these great developments that China has undertaken, they don't look outside of first-tier cities, the very metropolises and the city centers, when their fact is, for example, migrants being evicted all the time. Interesting as well regarding the point on indigenous. I mean, the recent protests in China, they broke out because of fire in Urumqi in Xinjiang that killed people. And it's good to see that solidarity happening. And yet, I think that then there's this strange view that this is all Western backed and it's all color revolutions, and that just discounts the agency of people. I think that is, again, it's actually kind of funny because when one sees the rhetoric of Western governments towards domestic protesters, they're always like, oh, it's just, like they're Russia and China trying to undermine us. And somehow this reflection of that is not perceived.
Yeah, thank you. So what I'm going to do now is we'll bring the panel together. We have some general questions, but before I do that, I did just want to ask Tina one further question, which is when we look at these tensions between US and China, how are they playing out that you see in tangata whenua spaces in Aotearoa, New Zealand?
Actually, it's not else. It's one of the ways in which this plays out is that we become co-opted, and I see Indigenous peoples being approached and co-opted into Chinese state rhetoric, not just in Aotearoa, but around the world, which is why I say it's a known strategy and tactic. One of the ways in which this happens is that in order to get your issues onto the agenda of, for instance, a human rights forum like the HRC, the Human Rights Council, it can be very difficult. And in many of these transnational forums, you might only have 90 seconds to 3 minutes to be able to state your case and hold your particular state oppressor to account. And whereas member states have significantly more time and more opportunities to speak and to politically shame other nations. And so if diplomatic shaming is a part of your political agenda, then that can become a very alluring and seductive option. And so what we've seen, one of the tactics that we've seen is that Chinese state nationals, not just China, I should say, there are other nations that have done this as well, have sought out relationships with Indigenous peoples and offered to diplomatically shame our Western oppressors on our behalf and establish relationships along those lines. And so, and then we look at creating relationships with these nation states. I have to say, and I just wanted to support what Brian was pointing out, which was that, much of the imperialism that's playing out, particularly in the post-war era, is actually Western imperialism being operationalized by China. And we haven't actually seen that the end game of this would play out any different. China doesn't seem to offer, from what I've seen, offer us anything functionally different in the future where we are aligning ourselves with them, and particularly when we look at the state treatment of Uyghurs in Xinjiang and the state treatment of our relations in Taiwan and the state treatment also in other instances like Tibet, like Hong Kong, then there is no reason for us to believe that. And in fact, if you look at how China kind of presents and represents itself in these transnational forums on Indigenous rights, traditionally what they do is that they turn up to places like the Permanent Forum specifically to say that Indigenous peoples do not exist in China because everybody comes from China within Chinese borders. And then they say that again as they annex other states, that everybody also still comes from China. So if you are within the borders of China, even as it expands and starts to annex other states and oppress the Indigenous peoples of those regions, they automatically become Indigenous Chinese. We should recognize that rhetoric because that's also the rhetoric that's played out here in Aotearoa, where they say everybody's Indigenous to New Zealand if you're a born New Zealander or if you're a New Zealand citizen as well. So those are some of the ways in which we see that playing out. I did want to, if it's okay, Anjum, I did want to point out that there are some comments in here that I think actually need to be moderated out by Candy Wahanui Peters. One of those comments points out that, Chinese are also our tuakana. Of course, Chinese, you can argue that Chinese are our tuakana in that space, but just because you're an Indigenous tuakana doesn't mean you can't also be a colonizer. And we should also recognize that because we're currently being colonized by Maori here in Aotearoa, Maori political leaders here in Aotearoa, in the names of Shane Jones, Winston Peters, and David Seymour. And so just because you are, even if you are Indigenous, doesn't mean you can't be a colonizer. And that's what we're talking about, is the colonial harm that's being carried out by the state, by the Chinese state. The other thing that I wanted to say to that also is that the context within which I raised the tuakana status of Taiwan is that as a global Indigenous movement, we have never left anyone behind, not least our tuakana from Taiwan, which doesn't mean that we don't have other tuakana. And in that space, we also would not leave our tuakana behind from Tibet. We also would not leave our Han tuakana behind. We also would not leave any of our tuakana behind who happen to be living in Xinjiang. The point of what I've said is that it is a collective movement and we don't throw each other under the bus. And finally, to that point, Anjum, I wanted to say that our Indigenous protocols are that we are here first and foremost to listen to the voices from the ground. We do not talk over them, Candy Wahanui Peters. We do not start telling people from that region that they should be thankful for the colonial harm that they are speaking to. That is not an Indigenous practice. Kia ora, I'll sign off there.
Thank you, Tina. All right, so let's just go to some of the other general questions. And, I'd be interested, and I'll pass over to you, maybe Bali, to start, is what does anti-colonialism, and I know that you said you all don't use the word colonialism so much, but what does Indigenous solidarity look like at this time of heightened US-China tensions? So how can other people, other Indigenous peoples connect with you? How would you connect with them? And how would that solidarity be strengthened, do you think?
Thank you, and I'm very, very sorry because I don't often speak English when sharing my thoughts. So
you're doing great.
So your question, maybe Brian, can you help me translations to Mandarin?
Yeah,
Sorry.
像 solidarity 就是一起团结可以达到什么？会对你来说，你会觉得应该要做什么？ 然后是反对像居民啊、什么帝国主义啊之类的。
Oh, okay. Oh, thank you, Brian. And I because colonialism is the complicated the issue, but I think I know the indigenous movement in Taiwan are connected to the indigenous movement around the world. So it's not a lonely indigenous people in the Taiwan to fight and give our indigenous people right. And but I think the nation is the problem to indigenous people because nation have often caused harm to indigenous people. What we really need is a country, and that puts indigenous people perspective at the center. So not always focusing on the human, because I think the image is very difficult because indigenous peoples have deep connection with the island and the land and the nature. So the country is things the always focus on the human issues. I think the imagine country is not the same hours imagine the countries problem. So is my opinion.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And Brian, I'll address the next question to you in terms of what do you see as the connections between the US and Chinese governments' imperialism and colonial strategies? Are there any similarities, or what are the key differences between the strategies of the two countries?
Yeah, I think part of it is strategy, but also just historical particularity. Because I think that, again, US dominance is because of World War II and what happened after, and that has not exactly replicated itself. And so China, of course, will do things very differently. And I think that particularly the abstractions that they use to justify their actions are different in that sense. I mean, US always talks about democracy and it justifies foreign intervention on that basis, even as, of course, there's all this issues internally. And then China, for example, will talk about, again, this anti-imperialist rhetoric. And yeah, it is true that there's a time in which China was, of course, resisting Western imperialism. But I think, again, as was brought up, you can be both a colonizer and also be colonized. And so there's that. But then I think China has done a very good job at, in fact, embracing this hyper-capitalistic society development and then branding it as left-wing still. And I think that that is something that is different. But I think that particularly when we look at, for example, actions with Belt and Road Initiative or setting up the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, these are institutions that are modeled after the World Bank and IMT and so forth. And though there's a lot of talk of, oh, we're not going to intervene in your politics, we respect your sovereignty. That is often not actually true when you look at the economic kind of relations that results in terms of, for example, the way that, for example, they come in and build in, let's say, Central Asia with plants that can be tremendously polluting while framing it as environmentally friendly. And so a lot of it, I think, just we need to look beyond the rhetoric of states with both. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that. I'm just seeing that there's we're getting quite a lot of questions in the Q&A. So I might just pivot to that a little bit if you don't mind, and then we'll see how we go. Because we also did have a few more questions here, but let's address some of the audience questions. So that first question, perhaps Brian, you might be able to answer that as to whether there's a gulf between People's Republic of China, Chinese people, and non-mainland diaspora Chinese when it comes to the Uyghur genocide. And can we bridge that gulf?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that what's interesting is that there's this tendency in the West to project the dynamics in the West onto China. And for example, Han people are migrants in the West, and then they are the majority and the colonizers in China, also Taiwan. So I think there is that issue. And so that plays out in terms of, for example, the diaspora, and that in terms of, for example, the Chinese diaspora, there is this tendency to project the dynamics in these Western contexts then onto China. And I think that there is also the issue, which is the classic exile issue, that if you speak about these causes in China, you may have to leave. And then there are perception gaps that result in that sense. And then it actually often then will fall to the diaspora to do advocacy in the sense. But then I think, as I alluded to, there then leads to that some of these groups will align with very right-wing actors because there's just a lack of space, it seems, on the left. And so I think it's a challenge. And I think that it is still, from a Taiwanese perspective, that is pro-independence, in fact, I feel there's a need to stand in solidarity with Chinese people protesting against their government in that sense. And I find it very ironic then that as someone who's pro-independence, then the people that are pro-unification with China sometimes don't talk about the struggles of Chinese activists on the ground. So it's actually also difficult in that sense because information coming out of China can be limited. But then, I think that sometimes even just looking at the state and what the state is saying, it's quite heavy-handed and transparent, to be honest.
Fair enough. Thank you. The next question, Grace, I think that was quite similar to the question that I've already asked Bali. And Bali, also, if you would prefer to answer in Mandarin and have it translated, feel free to do that. We're quite happy for that to happen, okay? Tina, I think I'll give the next question to you around from Michael. To what extent does the left inherit ideas of anti-imperialism and national self-defense from the legacy of Stalinism, which sought to justify itself in such terms? If you want to, are post-Cold War terms like humanitarianism preferable, and what makes the defense of Chinese government attractive to young people today? Any of those, just pick the one that you want to
That's
speak.
okay. Thanks, Anjum. I want to say, and it's not just young people, there are a number of people who, from multiple generations, who are looking towards Marxist models as an alternative, because some of what we see in Marxism resembles the economic practices of Indigenous communities. And so, there's a little bit of romanticism, a little bit of fetishism, I would say also, that results from us looking to these alternative models, not only because we see them as being oppositional to capitalism and Western settler colonialism, but also because we see some aspects of it as an economic model that resonates with us when we think about the Indigenous economic models as well. But we have to be really careful about how that plays out in a geopolitical sense. And I've already alluded to the fact that when we align with these models, you can't isolate it as an economic model. It comes with the full political political cart that comes with it as well. And so the other thing that I would say is that, again, just looking at it from a rather romanticist lens, is that actually the neo-imperialism being operationalized by China since World War II is classic Western economic imperialism. And so this also speaks to a couple of the other questions. Sorry if there were a couple of other questions in here around improving the anti-imperialist by Grace, improving the anti-imperialist stance of Aotearoa Indigenous folks against all forms, including China. But also there was another question in here from the anonymous attendee that says, it feels like we only have two solutions to choose from. And one of the things that I would say in relation to that is, rather than, and this is one of the things that I'm not irritated by the question, but I do get irritated by the suggestion that we only ever have to choose from other Western developed ideas, structures, theories, and frameworks. We have Indigenous models of leadership, Indigenous models of ways of being, knowing, doing, relating, leading, and those have been in place for like tens of thousands of years. I mean, if you want to go right back 200,000 years, but tens of thousands of years before before the Western imperialist economic model became globalized through the age of discovery, and that is, I think, a really important part for us to engage in, which is why I work in the doctrine of discovery, so that we can see how and chart how and point to the way in throughout history in which the Western imperialism and colonial model became exported around the world, how it looked how it informed both World War I and World War II, how it created this economic hierarchy, which came with a political hierarchy in 1944 with the Bretton Woods Conference, which really formed the global economic order. And then how that informed the United Nations, through which we would examine and debate issues of human rights and political rights and civil rights. And so if we see how the doctrine of discovery informed this journey, I think we're more clearly able to see colonialism as a system that can be operationalized by any state. And we can oppose it as a system rather than getting drawn into almost like these state personality fights between each other as well. So that would be my answer to a number of those questions, is that actually we need to look to Indigenous models. If the question is one of colonial oppression, we need to look to Indigenous models, not other relatable Western models, because as we say, Marx, Stalin, all of them, as Papa Moana used to say, they're just other white guys who were often racist.
Yeah, thank you. So Crystal's asked if there's any reading recommendations. So just for panelists, when you're not answering, if you want to pop stuff in the chat, we can send that out, or we can pop some of those on our website where the recording of this webinar is going to go. Before I go to Bali, there's just this comment that relates to something you said, Brian, about inequality in China, and someone questioning whether the inequality in China is greater than that of the US, and whether you wanted to respond to that comment.
Yeah, I think that it's the question, like, who makes your iPhone? I mean, there are tremendous factors in China, and what's very interesting now is we're seeing this moment in which the US somehow wants these jobs back, because usually what happens is when countries rise up, then they offshore the jobs they don't want because they are quote unquote 3D, dirty, demeaning, and dangerous to poor countries, and that's what happened with China. And now China is rising up in some fields, for example, rare earths, because that's tremendously destructive to the environment and harmful to communities. Now that's often going to Myanmar, which is also run by a military regime. And so there is that. I mean, just the remarkable things that have happened in the past decade, for example, just the migrants being driven out of Beijing, demolitions of their communities with very little notice. That is telling. And yet people just look at the subways, the bright screens, and that's all.
No, that's cool. Thank you for that. So again, Brian, I might ask you to translate, but I thought the question around mainstream media, because Bali did talk about media and Chinese media in Taiwan. So the question here is about how much oppression is due to mainstream media, which is often in control of either those in power or those who pay for it, i.e. commercial interests or advertising. Yeah, and also, interestingly enough, I'm just going to add to this, is now we're seeing media being owned by billionaires, like the Washington Post. There's a move to try and control the New Zealand Herald here, that kind of thing. So then it becomes, commercial interests that are owning the media and pushing a narrative that serves those interests. And does social media change things when it is also becoming state-controlled or controlled on behalf of oppressors? So good luck with translating all of that.
I did that by tech.
Oh, thank you. And I use the Mandarin, so I want need the Brian to translation. So I say the Mandarin. 在台湾其实是有那个原住民的电视台的，然后就是，可是因为是跟政府走很近，所以我们要表达自己的声音，可能就是只有给原住民看。可是其实原住民的事情不是只有原住民，所以这件事情应该要做改变，就是应该要让外国人不是外国人，让台湾人也可以看到。对，那其实我们也有常常跟纽西兰的电视台或是澳洲原住民的电视台合作，可是，在台湾这些新闻其实很少会让汉人的朋友看到。那会有这样的问题是，因为台湾是一个民主进步的国家，所以他们会觉得做这件事情代表我们很进步。可是主流的社会的媒体是要看你的市场的，就是这件事情其实是有没有市场，那就会变成说，它就只是在一个公共的事情做，它不会在主流的媒体出现。那因为 podcast 或是一些 YouTube，我们有这个机会，那我们就自己说自己做。那其实我们常常会有遇到内部的呃冲突，就是主流的媒体，然后是有原住民电视台，他们表达的意思，一般的汉人就会觉得说，哦，这就是原住民的意思。可是我们现在作为自媒体做 podcast 或是YouTube，我们其实就变成很像我们的意思是不对的，我们应该要团结在一起。所以其实对于中国或者是美国的部分，我觉得美国的影响真的很少，因为台湾原住民长期在台湾的主流媒体的叙事里面，其实真的不知道美国对于中国的，美国对于台湾的影响。可是，在这个媒体形塑下面，就觉得中国其实对我们是比较靠近的，就是以过去的长辈，所以我们其实是想要介入，很积极的去介入媒体，然后用媒体的方式来表达我们的声音。那其实我们的声音其实是多数了，目前是这样子。OK，sorry 。
I took notes. I can translate. So Bali was saying that in Taiwan there's Indigenous Television Network, which is a television network, but it's close to the government. It's government funded, so that can make expressing our own voice is difficult. But then Indigenous issues are not only just pertaining to Indigenous. To allow society to kind of see this can be more difficult. And there's cooperation with New Zealand television networks and other television networks. But then sometimes the Han people in Taiwan don't see this, but Indigenous people watch that. And then there's a question of how to have Indigenous perspectives appear in a market-driven media environment. And so that also leads to a further challenge of how Indigenous issues don't appear in mainstream media, because again, Indigenous television is government funded. But then with podcasts or YouTube or social media, then creating platforms or such as Dear Han people, for example, people can do it themselves. And that allows for further creating of solidarity and expressing of voices. But then there's also the issue that, for example, mainstream Han society looks at Indigenous television and thinks, oh, these are the views of Indigenous people, when there's, of course, much more diversity than appears there. But then in terms of the UN's influence on Taiwan, it's not covered as much in this context, but China seems closer. And so, yeah. I don't know if I missed anything.
Thank you. Thank you for just impromptu helping us with the translation.
Thank you, Brian.
Really appreciate it. I'm just gonna go down. I think there's one that Tina, you said you would like to answer, so it's a bit further down, and I think it's a good question. So I'll just quickly read it out. It feels like we have two solutions: to either further align with the US or to align with China, which appears to be a viable alternative to maintain what we have in terms of trade, political privilege. With this, there feels to be a sense of urgency to pick a side as tension increases. How do we overcome this and orientate ourselves as a nation to think differently? So, Tina, over to you.
Thanks, Anjum. So that was kind of what I was addressing in my last answer, though, which is really around, it's not really a viable answer to oppress one state force with another state force. And we're also, there isn't that much of a choice between the two, because China is operationalizing Western imperialism anyway. So we're not actually swapping one out for, there's not actually a functional difference from an Indigenous perspective from one to another. And so, swapping out oppressors isn't really a choice at all. What I would say is that we need to oppose colonialism in and of itself wherever it is happening and whoever is operationalizing that colonialism. And so if that is happening to our relations in Taiwan, we need to oppose that wherever it's happening in the Pacific, particularly from the US, for instance, against our Kanaka Māori relations, then we need to oppose that as well. We need to oppose colonialism wherever it's happening. The option for that, the righteous option for that, is to support Indigenous rights and to support Indigenous models wherever those models are, and listen to the people of that place also, and provide the discursive space for them to be able to speak to their own solutions, not try to, the other part of that is also not to try and laterally colonize people with our idea of what's the best thing for them to do as an Indigenous nation. Indigenous rights are about supporting the continuity of ways of knowing, being, doing, relating that extend from the soils and the waters through the people of those soils and those waters, wherever you may be. And that's the model to be supporting, not necessarily any particular nation state. The global Indigenous movement, if you look at it historically, has never worked with governments. This is a very new phenomena that we're seeing in Indigenous resistance also, is the idea that Indigenous peoples can further our cause by working with state governments. And I think that's a very dangerous space for us to be wading into as an Indigenous rights movement.
Thank you. Brian, you mentioned in your comment, I think this question's picking up about that, about how the US has all these bases around the world and China doesn't. And so then the question is talking about the panelists' views through China appearing as a less militaristic nation, focusing more on endearing itself to smaller developing nations like some of our Pacific neighbours by providing resources for critical infrastructure projects, rather than the military bases. And so did you want to comment on that a little bit more, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that part of it is, for example, this conflation of geography. China borders 12 nations. The US is, in terms of expanding its power, its land borders are relatively limited. And so that's why it needs bases. So I think there's this conflation of the two when just two are different geographically. But then on the other hand, we in Taiwan, we have like planes flying to threaten us every day, literally. And every day I just look at the government, the Ministry of Defense, and the press release they put out. It's like, oh, 12 planes a day, 50 planes a day. And there are naval vessels as well. For example, recently, China is now trying to show they have a capacity to blockade Taiwan, appearing around the entire island. And so we're at the receiving end of this. I think that Western leftists often are not, and so they don't perceive this. And military displays conducted by China in the Pacific are not only directed towards the US, but also towards other Asian countries. I mean, Philippines, Japan, who are, of course, more closely aligned with the US. But then I think there is that there are military threats from China against other places, and not just because there's a lack of bases. I also think that the lack of knowledge is somewhat concerning, because I always see this map circulated as though it shows all the US bases everywhere in the world. And the map actually shows bases in China. I think there's a real need to actually educate on that. I think that there's when people talk about this kind of abstracted comparison, there's a real need to do much more research there, actually. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for that. let me just see how we're going with the questions.
Anjum, while you're looking at the questions, can I just say, because it's really difficult for me to type into my phone, and people were asking about readings and books, so I can't type into the Q&A and I can't find the question. But The New Age of Empire by Kehinde Andrews, How the World Made the West by Josephine Quinn, Uncivilized by Subhadra Das, as well. Time's Monster by Priya Satya. Those are just a few quite recommended readings for looking at kind of global imperialism and the colonial project across time that I've found helpful. Anything written also by Arundhati Roy. I should say as well. Kia ora.
Yeah. I don't know either Bali or Brian if you would address this is the last question, but I think it's an interesting one about the use of the words genocide and genocide denialism, particularly, when we're seeing what's happening in Palestine with the huge number of deaths, decimation, forced removal, all of those things. And this person saying they don't want to minimize what's happening to the Uyghurs, but is genocide, the right word to be using in this context? Any thoughts on that? And before you do answer, I do want to give apologies from Rizwan Gul because we're hoping to have her here as a Uyghur speaker, but unfortunately is not well. So we will be seeing if we can get her to speak at a subsequent event. But yeah, just in terms of using the term genocide. And again, Brian, if you want to translate for Bali, if he needs that to be able to answer the question.
问题是关于那个种族灭绝，所以这是不是对的字用在中国，在比如说针对新疆维吾尔族之类的。I could respond first quickly. I think that it's very clearly colonialism. For example, Xinjiang means new frontier, literally. You can't get more colonial than that. In the UN working groups, and this is something Taiwanese indigenous who Taiwan is not represented to the UN, but indigenous can still participate in some working groups. The word that China uses for indigenous is 土着, which is like dirt people. That's and there's an attempt to push against that, and that's been resisted. And so I think that points to this. I think that we can talk about the for example, like there are people that would even say that Gaza is not genocide because this is just in Gaza, it's not all of Palestine. And I'm just like, okay, like, yeah. So the question is, how much do we want to finesse terms? But it's true that I think that there's this, because there's a tendency towards hyperbolic rhetoric anywhere in the world. And so people throw this around as a term very often in a way that sometimes doesn't always help. I do agree that's true, but I think it's really a question of where we draw the line.
Yeah. Bali, did you want to also answer that?
Okay, thank you. I use the Mandarin. 种族灭绝的部分，其实在台湾从荷兰时期原住民就一直面对，然后过去的祖先其实蛮聪明的，就是会跟他们谈条件，或是一直往山上跑，因为那时候的原因都是要资源嘛，所以就会一直逃到山上。所以到日治时期，因为樟脑或是一些事情，所以他们又真的到了山上，所以发生了很多很严重的冲突。然后这些事情其实可以回顾讨论，就是现在的中国或是台湾这个如果是一个国家的话的社会的话，其实面对战争这件事情，其实原住民从来就一直在为了台湾这个土地在打战，可是汉人其实没有，他们从中国逃到这里，然后或者在更之前明郑时期来到这里，然后面对日本人，他们很早就投降了。可是台湾的原住民跟日本人的抗争，一直到应该是比怎么讲汉人投降之后的10几年都还在打，是一直到了后面真的打不下去才投降。所以对于战争这件事情，原住民有另外一个想法是，我们从来都没有在畏惧。可是如果真的被国家侵占的话，我们是有自己的一个方式去面对种族灭绝的部分。然后 因为我们是新生代，所以我们其实没有感受到过去他们可能被压迫的时代。所以回过头，刚刚主持人讲的那个问题，就种族灭绝这件事情，我们就会很担心中国在台湾发生这件事情。可是我们跟长辈聊天的时候，他们其实是不担心的，因为他们觉得过去我们也是这样子走过来，可是现在的我们可能没有遇过，所以就很担心。那以及我们现在其实，在台湾很好，有跟像 Brian 你，就是我们有跟汉人的朋友有很多的合作。那我们其实就是确定了，在台湾是我们的生活的地方。那如果不管是中国或美国想要来夺取台湾，都不应该被容忍。我觉得这现在是我们的共识，而且我觉得比较实际，就是不要再去讨论说，到底是亲美或是亲中这种，我觉得都是假议题。因为对于台湾人来讲，我们就是原住民是没有办法去哪里的。那如果有汉人愿意跟我们一起做这一件事情，我们当然会觉得现在要解决的是中国的问题。对，sorry, I just
That's all right.
Thank you.
I'm glad you have so much more to say when it's in Mandarin. It's brilliant.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll translate. So on the question of genocide, Taiwanese indigenous have confronted this since the Dutch colonial period, because the Dutch did colonize Taiwan and other Western powers. And so what happened was either negotiating or going to the mountains. This occurred because there was this desire from resource from colonizers. And so this continued in the Japanese colonial period. And in this sense, indigenous have always fought for this land. Han people have not. For example, after coming to Taiwan or after the defeat to the CCP, during the Japanese colonial period, Han people surrendered earlier, much earlier. And then there was confrontations with the Japanese colonizers by Taiwanese indigenous much longer. And so we have never surrendered. We have our own ways of confronting genocide. But this generation of young people has not experienced that. And so when we talk about this occurring in Taiwan because of a threat from China, those generations will say that, well, this has occurred already and we experienced this, so they aren't as nervous. And so then we have Han friends that we collaborate with today, like Brian, me. But then this question of, for example, whether pro-China or pro-US is actually a fake issue, because again, there are these longer history that indigenous have faced in Taiwan.
Thank you. Thank you. I see we're starting to run out of time, but definitely we will try and make sure that any resources, because a lot of people are asking for resources. For example, Jeannie, who's asked how can a New Zealand-based expat from Taiwan access podcasts or YouTube content from Indigenous people. So Bali, if you have, or Brian, if you have, and you can message us afterwards, and we can get some of that information out to people. Also in the audience, if you've read some great stuff, please feel free to reach out to us so we can put that into the reading list. And, people in the questions wanting to be part of the solution, and how can we hook into some of these global Indigenous movements and anti-oppression movements. Tina, did you want to address that last bit of people are interested in supporting into things that are going on? Because the problem with the nation states is they have a lot of resources.
Yeah, that's right.
Disposal.
And even increasingly, the internet is becoming a heavily colonially moderated space as well, particularly as we move into an era where tech barons are lining up behind, for instance, Trump and his regime. But still, while there are voices out there like Brian and Bali's, I saw earlier questions, and I posed that question as well, around what are the best ways for us to show up for you. Not speak on your behalf, but to show up for you. And I think one of the things we can do is to share the content created by Bali and Brian as well, is to elevate and amplify the voices who are speaking from that space, because so often, particularly here in Aotearoa, we hear people speaking on their behalf, and not all of that is, I think, grounded or accurate, and it can be subject to other agendas as well. So I think not just books, and I've said some of the books that help for me that have helped to inform my ideas of imperialism and colonialism as a global project and as a system. But when it comes to the stories that we're talking about tonight, I think amplifying voices like our guests that we have tonight, what they publish and their podcasts or what they say is another really powerful way for us to be able to support them as well. And just noting also that in transnational fora, there are many ways in which, for instance, it's very difficult for some of our relations who are for instance, being oppressed by China, to have their voices elevated in transnational forums. So looking for ways in which we can also support. I think one time we've had at the Permanent Forum for Indigenous Issues, I've seen a Uyghur community member come along, and another time I've seen people from Taiwan as well show up there. So looking at how we can support them in those spaces as well is another powerful space for those of us that do go into those spaces. So can I just say quickly, Anjum, I just wanted to support like the whole semantic discussion around the term of genocide. If you want something to read, go and read Raphael Lemkin's works on genocide, the man who developed the term himself and the different tools and features of it, because that includes policies of assimilation. And people tend to get caught up in the idea that it has to be population-based massacres, not forced displacement of children, or policies that inhibit their ability to give birth to future generations, or, inflicting upon them conditions of living that make it difficult for them to exist culturally and functionally as well. And so there are multiple ways of understanding and features and tools of genocide that we commonly overlook, whether it's happening in Kanaki or whether it's happening in Xinjiang or whether it's happening in Palestine. And the pattern of denialism that we see around genocide of Uyghur peoples replicates the pattern of denialism that we see in Palestine as well. So just to I just wanted to support and echo what Brian was saying, but just read up on exactly what Lemkin has said around genocide himself.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And this is going to be the last question. I just wanted to address Hamish's question. And I think, Brian, you're probably the best to address it, is where you have Pākehā or, European New Zealanders who are going to jobs in China, being cheerleaders for China and smearing Uyghurs. Is there anything you would like to address to those kinds of people or people who see those kinds of people?
Yeah, I think it's kind of bizarre to watch, particularly in the age of social media, but there is this kind of career trajectory now of people who are usually white people that just jump around from the state-run medias of authoritarian regime to authoritarian regimes. The same person will be on RT, and then eventually a few years later, they'll be moving on to China. And of course, like the interests of these countries actually don't align, even if they are allied with each other sometimes. But then this has become this kind of career path. And I think that it's quite unfortunate. And I think that there's also this environment in which we live in today that is highly polarized, and people sometimes don't evaluate state media very critically. They criticize their own state media or the media that exists in the country they live in, and then somehow don't turn that same criticality towards the state-run media of other countries. And sometimes even the things that these people say is just not internally consistent either. They just go with whatever the state goes. I think actually what's interesting is campus or tankies, whenever something happens in China or that China's a stakeholder implicated in, they wait a bit to see what direction state-run media goes, and they take their cues, and then they come up with their discourse after that. And that gap, I think, is important to note and keep in mind when dealing with this.
Yeah, thank you. I'm so sorry. There's so many great questions still left, and we've run out of time. And especially, Grace, your comment about, the coalition of Muslim countries that says China does not mistreat Muslim people. And it is so frustrating. And we also see these countries who could do so much for Palestine and for peace there and not doing that. Yeah, as someone who is Muslim, I find that really frustrating too. But look, I will just conclude before we go to Karakia from Tāwhana, to say that I really want to thank all of you that have attended. We did intend this to be a 90-minute session, and I know people would have had to drop off, but the recording will be there. Watch out on our socials as well for that. And yeah, I think, it's been a privilege to be here to host all you lovely people, the panelists and MC this session. And I hope that people attending have found it really useful. So with that, Tāwhana, I would like to pass over to you to close us out. Thank you.
Kia ora, Anjum, tēnā tātou e tautoko ana i ngā mihi kua mihia. Ki o tātou Kaikōrero te pō, Bali, Brian, rātou ko Tina, anei ngā mihi matakuikui kia koutou, anei ko ngā tai o here taunga e pari ana kia koutou, e noho ana ki Taiwan, ki Amerika, ki Kātira, e te tuahine e noho ana ki tai whenua hoi anō, e mihi nei kia koutou. Just want to support the mihi, the acknowledgements that Anjum shared, and hearing our fantastic speakers this evening. And I'll just close us off with a karakia and kia hoki atu rā te mauri kia rātou māko wehe kia rātou ngā atua nō reira. Kia tau mai rā ko te mauri noho ko te mauri tū, ko te mauri anuku, ko te mauri a rangi, ko te mauri aroha, ko te mauri āio, ko te mauri tērā o ngā tūpuna, tau mai rā ko taua mauri, ko te mauri ora. Uhi wero, uhi taia, hara mai te toki, haumi e, hui e, tae ki e. Kia ora mai tātou.
All right, ka kite everyone. Hope you have a lovely rest of your evening.